You're going to hear from my friend, my fellow master gardener and co-presenter, Ann Wilson, in just a few minutes. But first, we would like to talk a little bit about the background of this presentation. As you heard in the introductions, Ann and I are both retired helping professionals and have been intrigued for some time by the benefits that gardening, that being in nature, that being in gardens seem to confer. In this first session, I'm going to begin by sharing some examples of how historically nature has been used to benefit people emotionally. So we're going to do some globetrotting, we're going to do some time travel, and then I'm going to share some of the findings about the psychological, emotional, social, and cognitive benefits that we derive from playing in the dirt. Anne is then going to pick up and talk about the physiological benefits that we experience when we're in our gardens. Now, this is not meant to be an academic presentation. Rather, it's just an introduction to some of the research that's behind what we already know as gardeners intuitively. Now, in the second session, which is, I want to remind you, is the same day of the week, same time, same place, Aisha Salazar, who is the extension agent for Family and Consumer Sciences, is going to talk about the health benefits of particular vegetables and herbs. And these are vegetables and herbs that you can grow in your own garden. And she's going to be joined by a master food volunteer, Stacy Vieira, who is going to demonstrate how to use those ingredients in preparing healthy and nutritious dishes. And I would like to say that this is the first time in many, many years that the two sides of the extension house on consumer sciences and horticulture and natural resources are teaming together for a presentation. And we are very excited about working together. But before we get into the presentation, we want to start by asking you what benefits you get from gardening, what benefits you get from being outside in nature. Aisha is on the call, and Aisha, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you explain to people what we want them to do, and then what magic you're going to perform?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. So I put into the chat a website for menti.com. If you click on that link, you'll have this question asked. What benefits do you get from gardening? So it'll have Tricia's question pop up when you open up in a new browser, and then you can put in up to 3 options and submit your answers in there. And then when you do that, it'll start creating a word cloud that will populate, and I can show you what that will look like in just a second. I can see that people are starting to do it, so I can actually share my screen, and you can see here some people have already responded with benefits that they receive from gardening. And the larger the word, it means that that's something that more people are putting in. So we'll keep this up here for a little bit longer. Tricia, let me know whenever you want me to stop sharing this.
Yeah, we'll just give people another 30 seconds, so type quickly. Anne, do you have any comments about this? This is really cool.
I think it just underscores what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
This is great.
Well, this expression, gardening is cheaper than therapy and you get tomatoes, I first encountered. I saw it on a sign in a garden shop in Quebec many years ago. It was in French, of course, but my rudimentary French held me in good stead. And at the time, I remember thinking about the universality of the gardening experience. But since then, I have learned that across time and across cultures, people have understood that connecting with the soil does something for us both emotionally and physically. It affects us in a very positive way. So let's look at a few examples from history. This is a garden. It is a rendering of a wall painting that was found in an Egyptian tomb in Thebes circa 1500 BC. And it said that Egyptian healers prescribed walks in gardens so that people could regain their equanimity. There is also some evidence that gardens in Mesopotamia were used for that same kind of therapeutic purpose. Now, of course, we're all familiar with the medieval gardens that monks tended in Europe. Now, these gardens could be quite large, and they contained both ornamental and food-producing gardens. They also contained what are variously called infirmary, healing, or medicinal gardens. And those gardens contained herbs and plants that were grown for their so-called healing properties. Now, for monks at that time, tending a garden was analogous to tending one's soul. And so there was a meditative, there was a contemplative aspect to their toiling. And in one source I read, it stated that Benedictine monks were instructed to care for their garden tools with the same reverence that they would accord any item that they used on the altar during worship services. Now, if you didn't recognize this plant, any master gardeners who are on this call, it's a chamomile. And I'm sure most of us have drunk chamomile tea at some point in time. Chamomile has been a staple in healing gardens for centuries because of its purported health benefits. If you want to learn more about how you can design and grow your own healing or medicinal garden, you can go to our website, mgnv.org. There is another presentation that a master gardener did on that same topic. So we're going to fast forward a couple centuries and go across the pond. For those of you who attended Anne's and my lecture last year on gardening in troubled times, this slide might look familiar to you. What you're looking at is an order that General George Washington promulgated a few months before the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. And in this order, Washington is recommending that his troops grow greens and vegetables for their own use. Now, there was an obvious practical benefit for this. Troops would have access to fresh food that they might not otherwise have. But in the order, he talks about another benefit and his hope that the act of gardening will contribute so much to the comfort and the health of the troops. Now, Washington was an avid gardener himself, and during the Revolutionary War, he wrote letters home with all manner of instructions about what needed to be done in the garden. And I like to think that when he was thinking about his garden, when he was writing these instructions, he was also deriving some comfort. And I think that has to be similar to the experience that many of us may have when in the dead of winter, we are curled up with a cup of chamomile tea and we're looking through our garden catalogs and we're thinking of spring, we're thinking about renewal, we're planning our gardens. Okay, we're going to jump another couple of centuries. And we're going into the 19th century. There was a very influential proponent of gardening as therapy in the 19th century, a physician by the name of Benjamin Rush. Dr. Rush is considered the father of American psychiatry. And in his book, which is titled Medical Inquiries and Observations of Diseases of the Mind, he observed that those who engaged in what he called digging in the garden, who, and these patients had mania, actually showed some improvement, but non-gardener patients who had mania didn't improve. You are looking at a topographical plan for the grounds of St. Elizabeth's Hospital and Asylum in Washington, D.C. St. Elizabeth's was established in large part because of the reform efforts of Dorothea Dix, who did so much to change the way People with mental illness were viewed. People with mental illness were treated. St. Elizabeth's was built on a farm, which was then outside the city limits of Washington. And it was built according to the tenets of another pioneer at that time, another physician by the name of Thomas Story McBride. And Dr. McBride believed that a person's environment influenced their well-being. So he advocated for specific architectural designs and the siting of hospitals like St. Elizabeth's in rural and pastoral settings. And if you Google Dr. McBride, you'll likely come up with a list of all the hospitals whose designs he influenced at that time. Now, residents of St. Elizabeth's and other hospitals and asylums for people with mental illness were expected to work in the gardens. And there was another practical benefit for that. But there was also a therapeutic benefit, and the patients were encouraged to take walks and also enjoy nature. Now, here's another example of a kind of garden that I believe served both practical and therapeutic purposes. It's a trench garden that was built near the front in France in World War I. And these gardens were actually quite common, and they didn't contain fruits and vegetables exclusively, which I think is very telling. Soldier gardeners at that time also grew and maintained ornamental gardens. Now, there's a contemporary study that looked at gardening and its effect on mastery. And mastery in this context is the belief that we have some control over our life. We have some control over our fate and our destiny. And what this study demonstrated was that feeling of mastery, that feeling that we have some control over our own lives, increased when people had responsibility for the care of a plant. So I speculate that people who have lost some control over their environment because of external circumstances, soldiers in war, for example, or the incarcerated, would experience that same increase in sense of mastery. And I think, Anne, you're going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits that people who are incarcerated derive. Now, the next couple of slides I'm going to show you are contemporary examples of how nature is providing that something that many of you described earlier when we asked you, what benefits do you get from gardening? And what you're looking at is a photograph that was taken by an award-winning photographer to accompany an article that appeared in the Washington Post. And what you are seeing is a highway leading from a military checkpoint into a city in war-ravaged Yemen. According to the articles, topiaries such as you see here can be found throughout the city. And their design and their placement was inspired by a gardener who wanted to give something back to the citizens of his city, something beautiful for them to look at in the midst of war. This picture is again from an article that appeared in the Washington Post much more recently. It's about, the article was about residents of Kharkiv, Ukraine, who have taken to living in the subway for safety. And if you look in these subway car windows, you can see tulips in makeshift vases. And what this picture and the previous one speak to me of is the powerful draw of nature to help restore some sense of calm amidst chaos, to help restore some sense of normalcy amidst horror. And what of our own experience in the last 2 years, which for many has been very traumatic. You know, the first year of the pandemic, interest in gardening swelled. I couldn't find many of the seeds that I wanted to plant. I couldn't find any potatoes, and it was because they were sold out. Enrollment in gardening classes like this skyrocketed. Well, why is that? What was drawing people to the soil? Is there any research behind this, or is this all just a bunch of woo? Well, the noted neurologist and author, Dr. Oliver Sacks, practiced at Beth Abraham Hospital, which is across from the New York Botanic Garden in the Bronx. And if you haven't been to the New York Botanic Garden or the Brooklyn Botanic Garden for that matter, put them both on your bucket list. Dr. Sachs used to take his patients to the garden for walks because he saw the clear benefit that they derived from spending time in those gardens. Shortly before he died, Dr. Sachs wrote, and I'm going to quote here, "I cannot say exactly how nature exerts its calming and organizing effects on our brains. But I have seen in my own patients the restorative and healing power of nature and gardens, even for those who are deeply disabled neurologically. In many cases, gardens and nature are more powerful than any medication." End of quote. Now, Dr. Sachs observed that some of his patients with Tourette syndrome, some of his patients with Parkinson's actually saw temporary symptomatic relief after spending time in the garden. And here's a piece of trivia gratis from this morning's presentation. Dr. Sachs himself was a gardener, and apparently he was an amateur expert of some renown on ferns. So there are many theories, many schools of thought about why we react so positively to nature. Don't have time to go into all of them today, but I just want to mention a few of them. One is environmental psychology, and there are two prominent environmental psychologists, Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, who developed a theory that they called attention restoration theory. They observed that office workers' attention flags as the day goes on. Well, duh, that certainly happened to me when I was working in an office. I'm sure it happened to you. But they further observed that office workers who took a break outside in nature had their attention restored, but office workers who took a break in a room with no windows and a room that lacked artificial light did not reap those same benefits. Now, in evolutionary psychologists posit that because our ancestral roots are in the savannah, we are hardwired to be drawn to nature. And eco-psychology looks at the interdependence between nature and humans for mental health and well-being. Now, horticulture therapy is, it's not a theory. It is an evidence-based discipline that uses gardening as a therapeutic intervention to help people who have developmental, cognitive, emotional, social, and physical challenges. Horticulture therapists work in a variety of settings, alone or with others. They, might be working with mental health therapists or occupational therapists, for example. They work in correctional facilities, shelters, hospitals, schools, nursing homes. They work with veterans who have PTSD, older adults with cognitive impairments, people recovering from surgery, women who are escaping domestic violence, the incarcerated individuals who suffer from anxiety and depression, people who have behavioral problems. and much of our understanding of the modern understanding of the therapeutic benefits of gardening comes from the work of horticulture therapists. And I have to, at this point, need to give a shout out to one of Virginia Tech's own, Dr. Diane Ralph, who was a towering figure in all things horticulture and in therapeutic horticulture also. So what does the therapy or what does the research tell us? And let me get my screen here. And there has been a lot of research. I participated in a lecture a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers was a faculty member at Kansas State University. Right before the lecture, she did a Google Scholar search using the search terms gardening and health, and she got 166,000 articles. One of the findings is that children who play in nature exercise more, have better social skills, greater attention spans, and more self-discipline. I would commend to you, he's not a researcher, he's an author and journalist who has written extensively about the research that exists, a gentleman by the name of Richard Louv, and he coined the term nature deficit disorder to describe the phenomenon that perhaps we see in our own children and grandchildren who spend too much time indoors, who spend too much time in front of a screen. Now, you will not see the term nature deficit disorder in the psychiatrist's diagnostic and statistical manual, but pediatricians are taking note, and Richard Louv has addressed the American Academy of Pediatrics on at least 2 occasions. Being in nature can improve cognition. I've already mentioned the work of the Kaplans. Other studies have shown that exposure to nature, being in a garden, can help people increase their observational skills. I mean, think for a moment the multi-sensory experience that gardening is. Sight, smell, sound, touch, and perhaps even taste. Gardening can help improve people's choice-making abilities. It can also improve their short-term memories. For people who have cognitive challenges, gardening or being in a garden can actually increase their attention, and it can reduce agitation, which is an all too common side effect of people who have cognitive impairments. In a group setting, gardening can also increase a person's social interactions, which is so important for people who are socially isolated. Around nature, people experience a greater sense of safety. Now, there is some evidence that green spaces and community gardens in neighborhoods have a positive impact in the neighborhood. The research is mixed about whether it actually reduces crime, but people in neighborhoods where there is green space, where there are gardens, report feeling safer. And that same thing holds true for women who are living in shelters to escape domestic violence. Gardening can also reduce anxiety and depression. As I've mentioned, it can reduce stress levels, and it also can help people who have mood disorders. In the 18th century, Thomas Fuller, another physician, wrote, "Many things in the garden, many things grow in the garden that were never sown there." People have understood for ages that emotional, social, and physical well-being are grown in a garden. And we are just beginning to have solid research to prove, to support those beliefs. Anne and I have provided you for further reading resource. So if you are so inclined, you can read for yourself just some of the sources that we use to prepare this presentation. And with that, Anne, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the physiological benefits of gardening.
Again, welcome everyone. And as Tricia has already very eloquently outlined, we know that gardening has both emotional, spiritual, and physical benefits. And one of the attractions for those of us who have gardened for a long time, and maybe those who are just thinking about it, is that at its simplest form, it requires only a limited number of tools. And so as a holistic approach to wellness, it's available to almost everyone. We know that worldwide research is mounting in this area. As Tricia said, we kind of knew, those of us who are gardeners kind of knew much of this, but it's also nice to have some data to back up our intuitive feelings. And so today I'm just going to do a bit of an overview of some of the physiological and neurological reasons for the benefits gardening provides to us. I'm going to say a little bit about things like weight loss, blood circulation, and other heart and circulatory benefits, good old vitamin D absorption, reduced bone loss, improved flexibility, improving our immune system, improved hand-eye coordination, and overall muscular strength, which helps us to improve sleep, as well as post-operative recovery and weight loss. We know that gardening has also contributed to positive outcomes in rehabilitation, post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD management, and impressive results in prison settings. And we know that the benefits are cumulative. So for those 50 and wiser, an early start isn't necessary, but it's also helpful in setting up that good foundation. Intelligent Health, which is a health and wellness monitoring organization in Basel, Switzerland, monitors a number of different global health issues. And they point out that the pandemic of physical inactivity is the fourth leading cause of premature death and contributes to preventable physical and mental health disorders. Their Department of Health estimates that an increase of only 10% in average exercise by adults would postpone 6,000 deaths and save about 500 million pounds financially. So that's about 1 billion US annually. Regular moderate intensity exercise, and I'll go back to the fact that gardening is considered by a number of groups, including the Centers for Disease Control, as a moderate intensity exercise, may reduce the risk of dementia, cardiovascular disease, a number of the mental health issues which Tricia already mentioned, and also diabetes and cancer of the breast and colon. And in an Australian study, gardening was found to be more effective than walking, education, or maintaining alcohol intake at moderate levels in protecting against dementia. So that's information from the Royal College of Physicians in the United Kingdom. It's helpful to note that in most studies engaging regularly in moderate activity of whatever type is more likely to result in positive health outcomes than extreme regimens irregularly practiced. So now let's take a look at the basic brain functions. Again, no need to memorize any of this, but I think sometimes it's helpful when people talk about the benefits of gardening. Well, why does that happen? How does that work? And so this is just an illustration to see the very basic brain functions that impact the benefits of gardening. We know that the entire brain contributes to increased neurotrophins, and we know that those neurotrophins are very important to both physical and mental health, or the lack thereof. And the hypothalamus and pituitary gland drive cortisol reduction, which brings stress relief. There is a part of the brain called the Raphe nuclei and the Mycobacterium vaccae, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, also contributes to reduced depression. And we know that increased neurotrophins increase mental health because they play key roles in modulating brain plasticity and behavioral coping. So they're very, very key to keeping us balanced. I'll just say a little bit about a couple of these things that reinforce the importance of gardening's role. And the first is reduced cortisol. For starters, chronic stress causes the levels of cortisol in the body to be continuously elevated. One sign of chronic stress is the body gathering excess fuel around the abdomen in the form of belly fat. This also explains why some marathon runners have a slight belly, because they tend not to give their bodies adequate time for recovery during heavy training regimens, even though the rest of their bodies may be in very fine shape. High levels of chronic stress can cause the brain to be unable to learn new things and to be more prone to forget things. That's because chronically elevated cortisol levels erode the neurons. It's important to also note that this is not the same as a temporary boost of cortisol that body experiences during exercise, which is beneficial. We know short bursts of cortisol production are in fact necessary for things like getting us to cross the street when the light is running out, or addressing to some short-term immediate issue like that. However, chronically elevated cortisol suppresses the immune system, and that begins to wear the body down. A good example of this is what happens when we temporarily pick up the pace of an activity. We know that higher blood pressure happens in that situation, and it's not a problem when it's brief and related to such an activity. We know we can then sort of finish that activity, settle in, have a cup of that chamomile tea that Tricia mentioned, and return to normal levels. However, we know that if the high blood pressure continues longer term, it can lead to significant heart disease that can also be life-threatening. There is a bacterium in the soil called Mycobacterium vaccae, and the exposure to this bacterium in soil that is in the ground, not packaged soil, stimulates the Raphe nuclei, which you can see in this picture, to produce serotonin. And the serotonin then goes throughout the entire central nervous system and calms the body. So again, I want to stress that the important part of this is the good news that working in the dirt actually allows us to breathe in, to have contact with this mycobacterium that acts as an antidepressant. The benefits will not be the same if people are gardening with packaged soil that's been sterilized and processed in other ways. So we want to make sure we're actually digging in the dirt that has some living matter in it. So let's take a look at blood circulation and cardiovascular health. As little as 30 minutes daily in the garden makes a difference. A 2019 study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine tracked nearly 90,000 adults in the US aged 40 to 85 for 11 years. Participants engaged in leisure time activities, including gardening, for about 10 to 59 minutes a week. And the study showed that participants had an 18% lower risk of death from any cause. Moreover, the risk of death from cardiovascular disease, including a heart attack or stroke, dropped by 12%. Adults who perform 2.5 to 5 hours per week of moderate physical activity, such as gardening, had a 31% lower overall risk of death. So that's pretty impressive. That's not a lot of gardening to get such a strong benefit from. According to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, modern intensity level exercise or activity, again, that's at 2.5 hours each week, can reduce the risk for obesity, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, heart disease, stroke, depression, colon cancer, and premature death. Additionally, those who choose gardening as their moderate intensity exercise are more likely to exercise that 40 to 50 minutes longer on average than those who choose activities like walking or biking. Now, this may be because gardening requires regular attention. We know that our vegetables don't grow if we don't water them and weed them and such. But it's probably also the case that even though many people sign up for gym sessions or commit to doing an exercise like that, over time, those things don't last for many people. So again, let's take a look at vitamin D absorption. Typically, gardening is not done at night. So while tending the garden, we're usually outside. And the body naturally produces vitamin D from sun exposure. And since vitamin D is protective against types of cancer and heart disease, it's logical that those with higher vitamin D levels could live longer. We also know that vitamin D deficiencies may be more likely to contribute to high blood pressure and other heart diseases. Being outside for 15 minutes midday with, of course, with their sunscreen applied is enough. In studies conducted by Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and also the Royal College of Physicians, vitamin D supplements did not reduce the risk of heart attack, stroke, or other cardiovascular disease. So it's better to be out in the garden. Numerous studies have also shown that weight-bearing exercise, essential in any kind of gardening, can help to slow bone growth, bone loss. And several studies show it can even build our bones. Activities that put stress on bones, such as lifting and moving pots, using a wheelbarrow, digging and transplanting, all of these stimulate extra deposits of calcium and nudge bone-forming cells into action. All the tugging and pushing on bone that occurs during the activities I've just mentioned also provide that positive stress needed. Again, it's that short-term good stress that we put on our bodies that helps us to stay strong. We know that vitamin D is also linked to increase in calcium levels. So we get a double benefit from the vitamin D as well as the strength from lifting and moving things. A 2014 Italian study published in the National Institutes of Health found that exposure to sunlight helped older adults achieve adequate serum levels of vitamin D. And while this is especially good news for older adults, younger adults also benefit. So let's take a look at our immune system. I've already mentioned that stress hormones can compromise the immune defense. And as mentioned earlier, short-term stress can be beneficial if we use it to remember to cross the street quickly or get out of the way of moving vehicles or other things like that. But they become problematic when the stress is chronic. And we know in our current environment, it just feels like there is no no let up in the stresses that surround us all the time. So it's harder and harder for bodies to recover or get the kind of recovery from stress needed in the amount needed. The activities of frontline defenders in our body, such as antiviral, natural killer cells, are suppressed by stress hormones when there's no period of restoration. Gardening lowers stress hormone production and elevates mood states, so it's not surprising it influences those markers of immune system strength. This is a fairly new area of research that is being explored in terms of extending the benefits in treatment of other chronic health issues. So something to stay abreast of as we learn more. And the good news is the more we learn, the more dramatic the case is to support gardening. Something that we probably don't think about very much is hand-eye coordination. It's an important skill for functioning in all of life, but it becomes even more important with aging. And so it's made possible in part by using the eyes and the hand to signal the brain to fully function together. And it's key to maintaining independence as we get older, because hand-eye coordination does tend to decline as we age. It can also decline after health episodes such as a stroke or a traumatic injury. Gardening is valuable preventative activity because the reflexes, speed and accuracy that can be needed in the garden are improved by continuing to garden. And it can also contribute to more robust recovery after a health episode has damaged this function. A simple task such as making a cup of tea or watering plants by hand would be difficult if you weren't able to aim and pour the water. Gardening builds and sustains gross and fine motor skills, and it's encouraging to see that a few more therapy programs, physical therapy as well as mental therapy programs, are using gardening or horticultural therapy to assist in improving hand-eye coordination. So let's take a look at all of the muscles here, which are color-coded, that we actually use in gardening. We know it's a great form of aerobic exercise. And we know that sometimes those of us who garden get so engrossed in the work, we don't really realize all the muscle systems we're using. Reaching for plants and tools and twisting and bending, all of these work new muscles. And for those of us who start the garden season, we certainly are aware of that at the early part of the season, but we know that as that continues, the body becomes stronger, we have more stamina and flexibility. And it's also an enjoyable way to practice body postures that alleviate or minimize injuries while lengthening and toning muscles. It was heartening to see that some of you in the word cloud made reference to this. So I want to just say briefly a word about muscular strength and flexibility. There are 4 types of exercise this includes. The first is endurance, which improves the health of heart, lungs, and the circulatory system. And we know that gardening-related exercise can also delay or prevent diseases that are common in older adults, such as diabetes, colon and breast cancers, and heart disease, because gardening builds endurance. The second kind of exercise is strength. Muscle strength that helps us to stay independent and makes everyday activities feel easier, like getting up from a chair, climbing stairs, and carrying groceries. We're doing all kinds of similar things in the garden, from going from standing to kneeling to bending. lifting soil and plants and other materials, as well as gardening tools. All of these help keep our muscles strong and can help with our balance and prevention of falls or fall-related injuries. And it's good to know it's never too early to practice these skills. Gardening offers opportunities to do all of those. Another area of muscle activity is balance. And again, we know this is something that we're encouraged to really pay attention to starting early in our lives. Many lower body activities can help to improve balance, again, including getting up from a seated position, or when moving from one gardening task to another, and heel to toe walking, which is easy to do and incorporate in gardening, helps that as well. The final aspect is flexibility. And we know that stretching before, during, and after gardening is recommended. And this can also improve muscle tone. All of these together, and with adaptations, which are very common to do in gardening, will help us to stay strong and healthy long into our third act years. If you want to learn more about ways to adapt these, or to see what else is going on in this area, you can go to the National Institute on Aging website. I think that's in the resource list. Gardening is something that we can do in a lifelong way. It's never too early to start creating the good foundation for continuing gardening later on. So something that Tricia also touched on, but I want to underscore again here, is that we're beginning to see more data on how gardening can improve postoperative recovery. Chalmers University in Sweden, and also the Royal College of Physicians in the UK, have significant data that show that postoperative patients who have a window with a view of nature, gardens or people gardening, experience a higher tolerance to pain, less fatigue, and fewer post-surgical complications than those who do not. People recovering from a myocardial infarct or a heart attack or stroke find that exercise in the garden, or using something called constraint therapy of a paretic limb, for example, is more effective, enjoyable, and sustainable than therapy in formal exercise settings. And a few more, we're just starting to see some of this incorporated in the US in postoperative and post-traumatic recovery therapy. So it's an area that will continue, I think, to see more studies in. And again, we've got more data right now from Scandinavia and other parts of the world, but I think here in the US, we're beginning to catch up a little bit. This is also true for people who have disabilities, that the recovery and the quality of recovery is improved with some access to gardening. Tricia mentioned prisons. We actually have more data that show that gardens in prisons have not only improved the quality of life of prisoners who are working in them, they have a calming effect on the prison community. So there are somewhat less incidents of disruption. And additionally, they can offer an opportunity for those who are in prison to learn a skill or a set of skills that can help them once they leave the prison setting. I want to just go back to this issue of the Mycobacterium vaccae I mentioned before. because it really acts almost like Prozac. And of course, it's free to those who want to be out in the soil. So again, it does this by stimulating serotonin production. So the old adage about playing in the dirt, as it turns out, that's really a good thing. And we want to note again here that this means playing in the dirt, not in containers that may be, that may include soil that is has been pasteurized or neutralized in some way. That's not going to give us the same impact. Just a quick note about sleep. People who garden regularly have been shown to have improved quality of sleep, and also falling asleep more quickly and sleeping more soundly. So shouldn't surprise anyone who's been involved in gardening, but nice to know that if you're having trouble sleeping, a little bit of time outside in the garden will help. Weight loss, good to know that 1 hour of gardening is equivalent to 35 minutes of jogging. And as I mentioned before, some people find that working in a garden is more likely to be something that they continue to keep in a routine. And so therefore the weight loss as part of a more holistic lifestyle is likely to be sustained because it's not episodic. Before we wrap up, I want to say a little bit about addressing inequities, because I think all of us who garden already know the benefits, some of them, and have been involved in keeping ourselves and others healthy. But I want to take a moment to lift up the important issue of inequities, because we know the health benefits of gardening are extensive, and it's important that all of us continue to explore ways to link them to vulnerable communities. We know that there are vast inequities between communities with large, beautiful gardening sites and those that have none. An increase in food security can occur when a community garden is within walking distance of residential areas, particularly in urban neighborhoods. And produce from a community garden can also help fill in gaps left when a food pantry or a food bank can't provide fresh produce. In a 2019 study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control, and this was from data collected from 2009 to 2017, lower income neighborhoods had a higher prevalence of pharmacies and convenience stores, but most of those were also places that contain very poor nutrition snacks and significantly less healthy options. And this further exposes low-income residents to abundant, energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods. Few of them had access to any form of community gardens. So let's all look for ways in which we reduce and eventually eliminate these inequities so that people in communities who really would like to have access do. To recap some of these key points, I want to just say that gardens may offer significant and physical and mental health benefits, and that when we have an opportunity to help low-income communities support gardens, we know that they too then can engage in physical activities and skill building that help them to be healthier. It's an opportunity to beautify vacant lots in some urban areas, and also to revitalize communities in industrial areas. Some communities, although not very many at this point, have begun to create green rooftop gardens. And as Tricia mentioned, although there's mixed, the data are mixed, it does appear that in some neighborhoods where gardens or any green space has been promoted, there appears to be a decrease in violence. It's not clear whether some of this may be the result of more community cohesiveness because people are doing something positive around tending the garden, or whether there may be other factors at play, but it's certainly something that we want to be taking a closer look at, especially as we think about cost-effective ways to have more resilient communities. So finally, we don't want to forget to mention that gardening brings the healthiest and most delicious foods to our table, because the vegetables, fruits, and herbs will not have traveled far or needed extensive storage in transit or been exposed to chemicals. So with that, I just want to remind everybody, in that context, Aisha Salazar, who is the extension agent for Family and Consumer Services in session 2, is going to talk about how we can use those wonderful vegetables and herbs to make some delicious foods. And until then, I want to leave you with a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Some of you may know her. She's a mother, a scientist, a decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. You probably know her best as the author of Braiding Sweetgrass. But she says in some native languages, the term for plants translates to those who take care of us. So I think that really sums up what we've been talking about today in terms of mental, spiritual, and physical health. And let's just go out there and keep gardening and make sure we're adding years to our life and life to our years in that way. So I want to just end with our commercial slide here that reminds us that the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia is an important, easy to access resource for everyone, both for more guidance as it relates to gardening and other plants and trees as well. So thanks for listening this morning, and we'll now move to questions.
Do you still get the benefits of mycobacterium vaccae if you wear gloves when you garden?
Yes, as long as you're working in soil, and I'm going to say outside, it doesn't strictly have to be outside, but it has to be soil that already has living organisms in it. So it doesn't matter if you have gloves on or not, you're actually breathing in some of that. And so the multiple exposure, but gloves are fine. You'll still get the benefits. Yes.
Are there any direct links between gardening and low intensity cholesterol level? Do you know?
You know, I think the benefit is related to the ways in which gardening keep our cardiovascular systems primed, and so that is going to help cholesterol. Certainly won't be an end all and be all, but it will contribute to healthy cholesterol because it's improving the entire and sustaining the improvements in the entire cardiovascular system.
Next question, do you have any advice for dealing with joint and muscle problems and pain from strenuous and repetitive garden tests?
So yes, there are two parts of that. And yes, I should have probably mentioned that, you know, there are people who garden, there are adaptations, I should say, and you can go on that, the National Institute of Aging website I mentioned, whether you consider yourself to be in an aging category or not, and find some nice adaptations for basic gardening practices. I would say two things. One is that we're seeing that gardening actually helps people with arthritis, for example, to reduce some of the symptoms. Now, again, it may not be, you may need something else along with gardening, but it actually helps to strengthen both the muscles and the bones. So the main thing to consider is, what are the garden activities that cause enough discomfort that there needs to be an adaptation? It may be, I know some people who have trouble with knees use kneeling pads or another way of sitting in a garden, that kind of thing. But it actually can be helpful. It may not sound that that's the case, but we're seeing more and more that you don't want to stop moving. You want to continue movement, maybe at a lower intensity, but definitely keep it up.
And a few months back, master gardeners in Tidewater, I don't remember which group, they actually did a presentation on how to garden appropriately. So they demonstrated the wrong way to lift a bag, the wrong way to reach across your garden bed, and then the right way. And maybe we can source that, and that could go up on the website.
I remember there have been a couple of those over the last 8 or 9 years. So that's thanks for reminding us about that. Yeah, it's not too difficult to both, well, one, to learn how to do those things correctly so you don't get injured. But the second, if there's already an injury, and then this is where I go back to the physical therapy for people who have had injuries. Part of that is learning how to do those things correctly, but it's more and more gardening is more and more being used as a way to help people who have had physical injuries to incorporate that in their recovery. Yeah.
And there is a local project at for those of you who are in Northern Virginia, at Mount Vernon and Nova Hospital. There is a registered horticultural therapist who is actually working with patients in rehab there.
Yeah, and somebody in the chat just mentioned ergonomics. That's another, for people who want to learn more, that's another key word to use to learn more about, or talk with your healthcare team about as well.
Okay, I believe that's all the questions. Thank you, Tricia and Ann. This is a wonderful presentation, very uplifting and very informative. And thanks for Aisha for that very interactive exercise.